we've called our final session appropriately Next Steps, Action Items to Create Investable, Nature Positive Outcomes. And we posed the question to a really skilled panel in terms to scale up investment in nature-based solutions. What do we have to do to enable our ambitions? So our moderator, Stewart, Elgie, Chair of Smart Prosperity and Professor of Law at the University of Ottawa, will lead the panel through this great conversation about how do we make it happen. So whenever you're ready, Stewart.
Thank you, Catherine. I don't think I'll ever be ready to follow Mark Carney on a panel, but I'll do my best. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Watching the last session, I really like the idea of starting off with why I work on these issues briefly. So my story is I left a Bay Street corporate lawyer job in 1988 to move to Alaska, work as a lawyer for the Sierra Club, and spent 2 years in court litigating to protect Alaska's wilderness and suing Exxon over the Valdez oil spill. And it really changed my life. I came back to Canada and started what is now the largest environmental law organization in the country, EcoJustice. And we spent a decade in court taking big bad CEOs to court to protect nature. And we won a lot of cases, but at the end of that decade, I came to meet some of these big bad CEOs and realized that they weren't really so evil, that none of them woke up in the morning thinking, gee, I'd love to destroy the planet today. They woke up thinking, I want to make a profit. And if they could do that in a way that actually lowered their environmental footprint, they would have been thrilled. But they worked in a market economy that made that really hard because it didn't value nature. So personally, I quit what I thought was a great job, went back and did a PhD at Yale in my 40s to learn economics. Got hired at University of Ottawa as a professor and started an environment economy think tank called Smart Prosperity, which I now chair and has a great group of staff and a network of over 100 professors around the world. And I said, little plug, I should say, we just put out a big report today on investing in nature, which I think you'll enjoy. So if you look at Smart Prosperity's website. So that's my story briefly. Today's session is about how do we unleash investment to conserve and restore nature, both for economic and environmental reasons. Economically, the World Economic Forum listed its top 5 threats to the global economy last year, and all 5 of them were environment related for the first time ever. Environmentally, you all are well aware of the risks posed by global climate change and biodiversity loss. Canada has made ambitious commitments to tackle both, to protect 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by more than 40% in that time. And hundreds of companies have now made similar pledges. So there's a lot of momentum for action. And to give credit, the government has done more in the last 5 years than we've seen in the previous 20, including a $4 billion commitment in the last budget. But there's a long way to go. Global estimates are we need to generate more than $800 billion in financing to meet our biodiversity targets by 2030, and we're at about 125 now. In Canada, that financing gap is about $15 to $20 billion, so still large. So how do we do that? How do we close that gap and pull in the private capital needed to meet our climate and biodiversity targets? Well, to answer those questions, we've got a great panel. First of all, we've got Mandy Gull, who is the Deputy Grand Chief of, I'm looking down because my light is over here, of the Cree First Nation, of the Cree Nation in Quebec. Amanda Reed, who is Director of Strategic Partnerships at Nature United. Craig Stewart, Vice President of the Insurance Bureau of Canada. And Rob Wilson, Director of Conservation Finance for Nature Conservancy of Canada, are hosts. So with that introduction, let me turn it over to our panel of experts to start picking away at this problem. I'm going to start with you, Rob, if I can. Let's break down what we mean by conserving and restoring nature. There's different types of projects across Canada that can conserve nature for different purposes, biodiversity, climate change, floods, fire. Can you talk a bit about these different types of conservation projects and what NCC is doing to help pull finance into them?
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Stewart. It's a great question. And I think it's NCC, I mean, we have a somewhat unique position that we work on the ground from coast to coast to coast. So we see firsthand the effects of climate change and also see the effects on biodiversity loss as well. So we are a strong believer in nature-based solutions is I think, the future of solving some of these problems. and are undertaking projects on the ground. So we're in a position to deliver actual outcomes. So it might be helpful just to give some examples. Certainly, we're undertaking projects that in many cases reduce the risk of avoided conversion. So avoided conversion of forest lands, avoided conversion of grasslands, and that results in significant carbon stores that are avoided in terms of emissions, as well as ongoing sequestration of those landscapes for carbon. We also work to improve landscape resiliency through restoration work. That's replanting native vegetation, reforestation, stabilizing stream banks, wetland restoration, pollinator habitat, a variety of activities that are nature-based solutions to help make a more resilient landscape. And then we also provide adaptation opportunities for species to adapt to the effects of climate change through ecological corridors or the ability to elevationally adapt to climate change, et cetera. So maybe a couple of examples, Stewart, of some projects specifically that offer nature-based solutions. We talk a lot about carbon. One of our main projects is the Darkwoods Conservation Area located in southeastern British Columbia near Nelson, which is the largest conservation project on private land in Canada, and it's also one of North America's largest forest carbon projects. So we're able to create very significant biodiversity outcomes in terms of protecting species at risk, connecting protected lands for much wider areas, and also able to avoid carbon emissions through protecting forest lands and using carbon credits to help facilitate our ongoing work on that. So that's one example. We're piloting similar projects in southern Alberta that we hope to expand to Saskatchewan and Manitoba in terms of avoiding conversion of grasslands, which result in carbon being stored in the landscape that can create credits for landowners. So in a way of incenting them to do the right thing. We also are involved in water management programs, wetland restoration programs, for example, in southwestern Ontario, that also retain water on landscapes and create biodiversity outcomes and mitigate against the need for built infrastructure because of the benefits they provide to downstream communities. So avoided flood risk, for example. Diminishing wetlands is a great example in central Ontario. We've been working with partners for about since 1974, and that has significant impacts on Georgian Bay and Wasaga Beach in terms of mitigating the effects of flood risk annually. And then just at the East Coast, I just mentioned, I think, working to protect coastal areas such as salt marshes that need room to migrate and deposit additional organic debris and serve as one of the first lines of defense against climate change. So a great example, again, of trying to deal with climate change and biodiversity loss through a nature-based solution that avoids having to build more infrastructure and more diking, for example. So just some examples of some of the nature-based solutions broadly that we're using, Stewart, across the country.
Thanks, Robin. We'll dig down into those as we go. Let me shift to Mandy, though. Mandy, Indigenous peoples across Canada have a huge role to play in conserving nature. Can you tell us about your experience and particularly with the Cree Nation territory, what you've done, why you did it, what were some of the key challenges you come across?
I just wanted to give my opening statement in Cree. My name is Mandy Gull. I'm the Deputy Grand Chief of the Cree Nation of Iwishchi. It's a real pleasure to be here today to share about the story of Iwishchi and our efforts to conserve our traditional territories. For us, we've been working on a lot of environmentally driven files for the past 20 years, I would say. We really began to react and respond to development that was going to be occurring within Iwishchi territory. Iwishchi is located in northern Quebec, James Bay. We're a nation of 10 communities. We have an extremely large land base, over 300,000 square kilometers. We like to say that it's roughly the size of Iceland, so it's fairly large. And one of the things that we were really forced to respond to about 10 years ago was the Quebec government's call to undertake Plan Nord, which was development of the Northern Territory in Quebec. And for us, in response to that statement from the government, we really issued a call to ensure that we undertook measures for conservation and protection of our traditional territory prior to any kind of development. So some of the work that we undertook was creating a conservation strategy based on the Cree vision of what Plan Nord would be. We had a number of targets that we wanted to reference, looking at things such as watersheds, water sources in the Cree territory, biodiversity, traditional habitats, traditional and cultural practices, wildlife, natural habitats, plants and fauna, food security, involvement of the youth and elders in ensuring that we outlined areas of conservation. In addition, I'm very pleased that after a number of years, our successful work in identifying these traditional territories set aside for protection were marked by a partnership announcement with Quebec in December of 2020, where we successfully outlined the protection of 20% of our territory to the highest degree of protection. And we continue to work on the targets of protecting 30% in addition by 2030. So I'm really proud of the work that our government has been doing. We have an amazing team. This would not have been possible without strong partnerships from our NGOs and of course our staff that have been working on this file for years and years and years, their commitment. And most importantly, I would have to say this would never have been possible without the knowledge and information that our traditional tallyman carried and identified in our territory.
Thank you, Mandy. I say in the 25 years I've been working on these issues, the Cree have always been inspirational leaders. So thank you for continuing that tradition. Amanda, Nature United is a part of a global organization. Can you tell us a bit about how that global expertise and experience can help inform conservation finance in Canada, unleash nature-based solutions for climate and biodiversity?
Sure, thanks, Stewart, and thanks, Rob, for inviting me today. I would like to recognize that I'm calling in from Ottawa, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin. So one of my favorite examples of conservation finance is the water funds in Latin America that were initiated by my global affiliate, Nature United's global affiliate. And after more than a decade, there's now 32 water funds that are supporting conservation over 7 million acres and benefiting 50 million people with clean and abundant water. One specific water fund is in Rio de Janeiro, where the municipality started collecting fees from downstream water users and making payments directly to upstream farmers and ranchers to keep trees on their lands that would protect the watershed. FEMSA, which is the second largest bottling company for Coca-Cola worldwide, has always been a financial partner in this initiative because their business model is dependent on clean and abundant water. So that's just one of the global examples that's informing our work for Nature United in Canada. In Canada, we have a very strong focus on supporting Indigenous-led economic development and conservation, and that includes supporting Indigenous economic development visions that align with cultural values and creating conservation financing vehicles for long-term stewardship, protection and stewardship of nature. We're also on the verge of launching a new groundbreaking study on natural climate solutions, which are actions to protect, manage, and restore grasslands, wetlands, forests, agricultural lands that avoid greenhouse gas emissions and sequester greenhouse gases. The study also identifies the scale of investment that's going to be needed to achieve that potential in the near term. Today on our panel, there are two things that I definitely want to emphasize. And actually, you can put up my slide at this point. Two things I want to emphasize as we're talking about creating investable projects and accelerating environmental markets. First point is government intervention is critical, and Mark Carney talked a lot about this. It's critical for establishing value of nature, for creating market structures, and for incentivizing changes in the way that we manage nature. My second point I really want to dig into is technology and the importance of technology in measuring value, establishing metrics, and monitoring outcomes, and reducing transaction costs. So to reiterate these points, I did want to share this slide. This is from a global study that was initiated by our global affiliate. It's the financing mechanisms that are needed to reverse global biodiversity decline. As you can see, nature-based solutions, carbon markets, biodiversity offsets, green financial projects, sustainable supply chains, and of course, natural infrastructure are included here. And two of the critical takeaways from this report was that government action is essential for paving the way, and nature must be properly valued across all economies. So I'm looking forward to digging into what this means for Canada, creating investable projects, accelerating markets here at home and abroad. Thanks.
Amanda, and we're going to dig down into those two key points in a second here. But first, let me shift over to Craig Stewart, who has a wonderful last name. Craig, you come at this from a private sector perspective, Canada's insurance companies. What do you think we need to do to draw private investment into natural resilience projects for things like climate adaptation and flood management?
Thank you, Stewart. Thank you to the Nature Conservancy of Canada for hosting this event today. I too am calling in from Western Quebec, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. I'll start off with a simple quandary. Resilience doesn't pay. Even though Canada is warming at twice the global rate of much of the rest of the world, and even though insurers are paying four times as much on average as we did before 2008, and even though extreme weather is costing Canadian governments and taxpayers over $5 billion a year, investors can't make money from projects that protect Canadians. And this is a similar situation in the rest of the world. This is a big problem. It's also a considerable opportunity. So we define climate resilience as the ability for a community to absorb future stress from floods, windstorms, wildfires, while continuing to function. Infrastructure such as stormwater system upgrades, flood diversion channels, or natural features such as wetlands or sand dunes or elsewhere mangroves or coral reefs are key to increasing resilience. Currently, infrastructure projects that build resilience are paid for by taxpayers, either directly or indirectly. For instance, the City of Toronto, Canada, is spending $10 billion over 10 years to upgrade its stormwater management system, building bigger pipes that carry more stormwater. They have designed some city parks, such as Trinity Bellwoods, as holding ponds and are installing cisterns under them. Currently, the city is paying for these upgrades through its budget, but is exploring other options. These options could include user fees, development cost charges, PACE loans, issuance of a green bond, or federal funding through programs such as the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. But at the end of the day, it's taxpayers, the public, who are footing the bill. Resilience is not investable yet from a private sector perspective. So here's my key takeaway. As an insurance industry, we're motivated to fix this problem. Now, you've heard from Zach Knight from the California perspective earlier. Insurers and reinsurers lose money in parts of this country, just as we do in California. But there are a couple of sideboards to consider. First, I'm going to be focusing on flooding in my comments today, but wildfire is also an issue. And local governments in Canada typically shy away from debt instruments, and this will be even more true post-pandemic. So we need to make not just nature investable, but to make resilience investable through a variety of market alternatives. And that's an opportunity, because if we can fix this for dams, diversion canals, and culverts, we can also fix it for wetlands and sand dunes as well. So presently, the World Economic Forum, the Global Commission on Adaptation, the government of the UK, and Willis Towers Watson are leading the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, or CCRI. Infrastructure Canada has signed on behalf of the Government of Canada, as have governments from Australia and the state of California. The goal is to translate the loss avoidance potential of a stormwater management system, or a wetland, into an investable instrument that yields financial returns, or to securitize the debt instruments used to finance resilience. After all, if we can securitize debt through mortgage-backed or asset-backed securities, we should also be able to do so for natural assets that provide resilience. The CCRI is a COP26 flagship initiative, and we're well placed in Canada to initiate pilot projects this year that price the value of natural assets and innovate financial instruments that apply private capital to building systemic resilience. Thanks. Back to you, Stewart.
Thanks, Chris. So I want to play off that comment you made and that Amanda kind of agreed that as it stands, nature conservation is not really investable. And I think people will know that a lot of that's because it's a public good. You can't walk into a store and buy an ecosystem service or a ton of carbon sequestration where you can a smartphone or potato chips. And so there's a big role to play for governments in creating the demand and the conditions that will ultimately unleash the private capital that will carry us through our goals. Government has to play a catalytic role if we want to unleash the private side of this investment. So let's explore that a little bit. What are the different things that governments must do if we're going to pull the private sector into this in a way that people say is needed? Amanda, maybe I can start there with you. What can you say about government's role in pulling private capital into conservation finance?
Sure, definitely. Yeah, I think the government has a huge role to play, not only in creating the markets, but also in creating the pipeline of projects. So both on that supply and demand side. For the market, I mean, simple, we need a perceived value and we need someone to pay for that value. And like you said, we're talking about a lot of public goods, air, water, ecosystems, and the government has the regulatory authority to protect these systems. And it can create regulatory frameworks that protect these systems and also account for the cost of externalities from our economic activity. And in creating these frameworks, it then can create the market frameworks for actually investing in nature. So I think a great example where Canada is leading on this, and Mark mentioned this as well, is pricing greenhouse gas pollution. So our national price on carbon, as well as provincial frameworks, not only disincentivize fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas pollutants, but through offset regulations and programs, create an investable vehicle for nature-based solutions. And the outcome of that is good for people and nature. The Great Bear Rainforest carbon projects, for example, were partly driven because the BC government set emissions reductions targets and created a market that First Nations could then develop and sell offset credits. And they're using those revenues to support community development, but also environmental stewardship and cultural continuity. Also, as part of that, really important was government to government negotiations to establish who had the rights to those carbon benefits so that they could then be traded. So that's one example where Canada's leading the way. There's other regulatory frameworks around clean water and biodiversity protection that we can draw on from other regions too. I think the government also has a really important role to play on developing that pipeline of projects to service these markets. So here incentives can play a very big role. Incentive programs can reduce barriers to entry, reduce switching costs and risks, reward early adopters, and help create the business case for investments. The government's new Net Zero Accelerator program's a great example, as well as the current investments in forest industry transformation, the IFIT program, as well as the Canadian Agriculture Partnership CAP program. Great examples where these incentive programs could be leveraged to accelerate nature-based solutions. And the funding could be used for things like funding upfront capital costs, bridge funding for delayed return on investments, cost sharing, risk management and insurance, and technical support for building this pipeline of projects.
Thanks, Amanda. That's a great start. I was thinking about Karen Clark-Whistler's comment last session that voluntary commitments are great, but as she pointed out, regulated markets for carbon are 40 times larger than voluntary markets. I thought that was a great stat. The same is true for biodiversity markets. So having government regulations can help drive the demand that pulls private capital in. You also talked about First Nations and Indigenous partnerships. Maybe I'll shift it over to you, Mandy, to talk a little bit about that. From your experience, what role can government play in helping Indigenous communities develop conservation projects?
Thank you, Stewart. For us, I think in working on this file, which has been extremely long-term, it's been a number of years, we have faced so many barriers in trying to access funding. And that was one of the biggest driving forces for us. 10 years ago, there was not a lot of funding sources available. And for us, a lot of that funding went towards ensuring that we had technical capacity. We had a wealth of information where we were sitting with our traditional tallyman land users. They were able to identify wildlife habitats, watersheds, areas of cultural value. But taking all of that information and kind of feeding it into a model was technical work that we had never really undertaken. So I'm very thankful that a lot of this work was done with our NCC partner, had and at very little to no cost for us, which this would not have made our protected areas a success. So I think that ensuring that there's funding sources available and removing those barriers to accessing those sources are the biggest things that you can follow if you want to ensure that First Nations are able to set aside key areas of their traditional territories for protection. In addition, I think right now when I'm looking at the type of funding sources that are available, a lot of them are for the establishment of protected areas, but we don't see a lot of long-term funding for the management of those protected areas. Ideally, we hope that the Cree territory that we've set aside for protection and conservation is going to be an area that we can use as a tourism, that we really want to showcase the beauty of our traditional territories with little to no impact, but trying to find funding for, the needs of employment, of park management, of, all of the different types of cultural programming that we want to run in those areas has been quite a challenge. So I think that for us, really looking at the type of funding that's available and trying to ensure that when you're looking at funding specifically for Indigenous people, that you're not looking at a blanketed approach. Indigenous territories vary. They're within so many different parts of Canada that I think you have to really ensure that when you're planning for this funding, that it does have a component of individualized approach, because needs can vary so greatly. The role and the use of what protected areas are for are very different for different nations. So I think there has to be that understanding that if you're going to be working with First Nations in Canada, that you have to really be aware that each reason that drives their protection is very specific to who they are, to what their cultural practices are, to what their traditional territories look like. And, most importantly, I think one of the things that we have to keep in the forefront of our minds is that we have to have sustainable financial solutions. That financing is always going to be available, and the key to that is creating employment that's linked to those sustainable funding solutions, and that employment is continuously available for the nation. And that's really going to ensure a successful long-term management of the protected area.
Yeah, those are great insights. Just one quick follow-up from Amanda talked about Great Bear, and one of the important things there was that the First Nations were able to share in the carbon offset revenues from conservation. I know in Canada in particular, where the vast majority of our lands are public lands and not private, and First Nations and Indigenous groups are part of all those public lands. Is that a big factor too? Because First Nations certainly can share in timber or resource economic benefits when lands are developed. Is sharing in the conservation revenues going to be a big part of the success formula?
I think it depends on the type of market that you're involved in, because for us, of course, we're setting aside territories that are extremely large carbon sinks. It would be very rewarding for carbon projects to be undertaken in our territory. We have different types of landscape, from peat to wetlands to, old growth forest, and a lot of these are significant carbon sinks in Quebec. But right now, being able to get within a system that sells carbon credits has been extremely challenging because of the fact that for us, it's hard to access here in Quebec. In addition, I think that we always have to remember that a lot of the territory that we set aside was prime conservation areas. And, in some of these spaces, they did not pose a lot of risk. And a lot of times when you're entering into a carbon project, you're choosing to eliminate that risk and undertaking a carbon project in lieu of the extraction of what that resource would mean. So we don't always fit within the criteria, but I do think that if there is a carbon project within Quebec, it should really target and allow for these spaces that have been set aside to be part of the program in some way. What that means, what kind of terms those are, I'm not sure, but I do think that it has to be reviewed and taken into consideration.
Thanks, Mandy. So, Craig, from the insurance industry perspective, what are the main kinds of things governments can do to make resilience projects investable for your industry and the communities you work with?
Well, governments, to start with, can act as first movers through their insurance procurement policies. That's one area. 70 years ago, urban fire was the greatest threat to communities, and insurers worked with local governments to devise ways to reward the construction of fire stations. And we all wear seatbelts now due to insurance incentives introduced in the 1960s and 70s. So we're at a sort of same place when it comes to flood and nature. Now that flood risk is escalating rapidly given climate change, governments and insurers can leverage insurance contracts to incent flood resilience, and that should include rewarding the conservation and restoration of nature. Secondly, governments can also provide seed funding to establish the partnering mechanisms that we need to flow blended finance. One of the key instruments that we're looking at with our work with Swiss Re here in Canada is the construction of flood management trusts that could purchase insurance contracts that provide financial resilience to downstream beneficiaries while flowing blended funds to acquire, maintain, and restore natural assets upstream. But you need that central mechanism. There's a gap in governance here, and governments could work to help seed the funding and create those entities such as flood management trusts.
And just building on Amanda's point, Craig, what about in terms of flood control, regulatory mandates to have no net loss of wetlands, things like that? Would that help to create some of the financial incentive to do this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, regulatory policies such as no net loss policies help in that, these issues are best tackled at scale. From an insurer perspective, we'd rather be addressing a series of wetlands, for instance, around the Greenbelt in Toronto or around the periphery of Ottawa, where wetlands around Ottawa mitigate about 10% of flood risk, according to the conservation authorities in the area. And we'd rather be addressing them as a whole, systemically, rather than just picking one or the other. It's much easier to attract private finance at scale that way, and it's much easier to design, an insurance framework that we've been looking at if you're looking at the whole thing together.
Okay, thanks. Rob, I'll invite you to chime in about things government can do, but also it's important to have standards and frameworks to ensure that these conservation projects are credible for investors. So maybe can you talk a bit about those things from your experience?
Yeah. Yes. Thanks, Stewart. Certainly, from a government perspective, I think Amanda's covered this pretty well, but the price signal is so important to catalyze markets. So we're seeing that in the carbon market right now. And we're seeing an uptick in the voluntary market and prices of voluntary credits, as well as sort of what people are expecting in terms of a regulatory market. So that's a really strong point. But it is important, critically important, that third-party standards be applied on projects so that there is some independent verification, independent auditing, and more importantly, some sort of common frameworks that we can start to measure and compare claims and outcomes across. So certainly that's fairly well developed in the carbon space. There's several international voluntary carbon standards. There are some beyond carbon standards that look at biodiversity, and some that are now looking even at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So it's really important from a credibility perspective that it's not just us saying these are what the outcomes are, it's having sort of independent audits claim that. It protects both the buyers as well as the sellers and all the intermediaries as well, right? So I'd really underscore the importance of third-party standards.
And Rob, one of the questions I hear from a lot of people is that doing some of those additional CCBA or Plan Vivo or gold standard biodiversity elements into carbon offsets takes more time and costs more money. You know that from Darkwoods, obviously. Is it worth it? Like, can you actually get a premium price for putting all that extra effort into generating an offset credit? Because if you can't, it's going to be hard to finance these things.
Yeah, great question. I think we are seeing a bit of a premium. Darkwoods is a good example where we're certified against the verified carbon standard. We're certified against the climate community and biodiversity standard, which measures biodiversity co-benefits. But we've just recently done the sustainable development standard as well. And we are seeing a little bit of a price premium in that, and that we were being incented to do that by some of our corporate buyers. But even more importantly, Stewart, I think, is that, our mission is conservation first. So carbon is one of the ways we can help further conservation. So I think it's incumbent on us as practitioners to continuously up our game so that we continuously improve the way we approach these projects and put conservation first and use these as tools to help us get more done, whether it's by way of protection and restoration projects. So.
Okay. Let me dive into the weeds a little bit. In preparing for this session, one of the things that all of you talked about was the importance of data, technology, and technical issues in actually making projects credible. So maybe just we'll sort of stick to a couple of key points each, but maybe I'll start with Craig. In terms of the conservation projects you work on, what are the kind of needs for data to make these projects real and investable?
So there's actually two areas to focus on here in answer to your question. One is before talking about data, we need to be focusing on valuation frameworks. That's our biggest challenge, is how do you actually value price? How are you going to go about doing that if you're going to be creating a framework to invest in nature protection? We've got some good innovative efforts in Canada in that regard. We've got the Sustainable Asset Valuation, or SAVI methodology, that IISD has developed. We've got the work of the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative. In particular, we're looking at the way they valued the White Tower Park ponds in Gibsons, BC for flood management. And you've also got the Credit Valley Conservation Authority's risk and return on investment tool. So there's some good work on valuation, but that's the central piece that we're sort of zeroing in on from an insurance industry perspective. And then, no matter which valuation model you take, typically you're looking at a blend of hydrological modeling data if you want to deal with flood. So how much storage can a wetland provide given varying intensity, duration, frequency of, or IDF curves of precipitation events? And combined with financial modeling data. So what are the exposed values of properties in the floodplain downstream, for instance? So the important thing to note is we've got all this. We actually have the financial data that we can combine with the hydrological data, with the ecological data. We have a lot of this. We just haven't organized and pulled it together and really had the convening discussions, place-based convening discussions that we need to come up with the valuation system and the data, put it together under some sort of entity to apply it.
That's interesting. So both ecological and financial data. Amanda, maybe just shifting to you, in your work internationally and in Canada, what have you found, not just about data needs, but about some of the innovative technologies that can help us to understand the ecological and financial values for these projects?
Yeah, great segue from what Craig was just talking about. So there's the raw data, and then there's the technology and the platforms that we can use to synthesize that data, aggregate it, and get it into the hands of project developers or investors. And so by way of a couple examples, NatureNet, our global affiliate, has launched a couple initiatives. One is the Sustainability Accelerator, where it's investing in new technologies to help save the planet, as well as specific investments in agri-tech companies. And so a couple examples that are especially facilitating regenerative agriculture practices. One company, Nori, has built a digital marketplace, and it's connecting buyers with projects. And I know there's a few models like that out here. Nori's unique. It's using blockchain technology and a distributed ledger to track these, ensure there's no double counting, et cetera. And I think this kind of relates to stuff Eric was talking about this morning with his group. Another really cool example is Growers Edge. It's an intelligence platform. They're using sophisticated data science and algorithms, and they're designing warranty-backed crop risk management plans. And so they're helping with the risk reduction for farmers, as well as accelerating regenerative ag practices. Another venture, Propagate Ventures, is really focused on the agroforestry potential, which is a great opportunity integrating trees into croplands, provides new revenue streams, reduces carbon, increases resiliency. And that model is really cool because they're helping with the upfront economic analysis, with actual project implementation, and then also identifying financial investment tools. So kind of a full suite. And then there's other examples like this one company, Kula Bio, and they're actually developing biological nitrogen fertilizer alternatives, which reduce emissions and can save farmers on their bottom line. So there's this whole suite of technology that in and of themselves are investable opportunities. And I think it's interesting that when we're looking at attracting private capital, actually that investment could be in the technology itself. And so instead of investing in a single restoration project, investing in the technology that's going to enable hundreds of restoration projects.
I think we've just lost Stewart. We promised you there'd be technical glitches, and indeed there are. You know what? Why don't we start with some of the questions that are coming in from our audience at the moment, and let you kind of, toss them up and down in terms of who wants to answer each question, and I'm sure Stewart will log on while we're chatting. First question, how do the panelists respond to Minister Wilkinson's assertion that incentives to protect intact landscapes are different from those relevant in the managed landscape and more challenging and should be considered separately? Who wants to take that one?
Oh, well, I was going to reference that in my final remarks. Even though I just spoke, I'd love to take it on.
Why don't you start by taking it on, Amanda?
I think that there's a lot of truth and wisdom in Minister Wilkinson's remarks. It's not exactly the dichotomy that I would choose versus protection versus restoration, but I definitely think when we look across the suite of protect, manage, and restore across different types of pathways in specific places across Canada, market solutions are more appropriate for certain pathways in certain areas. And this is, Mandy was kind of alluding to this as well. And so I think that tailoring these investable solutions where the data is there, the metrics are there, the price point is lower, those are really great pathways to be working on some of these solutions. In other areas that it just doesn't work, and in a lot of cases those are protected area, larger intact protected areas in the north, or but it's not always protection versus restoration, but there certainly are circumstances where markets just aren't ready or the data is not ready, and really we should be investing good old conservation dollars in protecting those resources.
Anybody want to comment?
Thank you. Yeah, I would add that from a private market perspective, sometimes it's easier to draw investment into the creation or restoration of something than in maintaining it. And so, as we've been working on the insurance frameworks in Canada, rehabilitating or restoring wetlands on agricultural land where it's been drained is somewhat of an easier proposition to quantify and to reward than to avoid the development of a wetland that already exists, which requires acquisition dollars up front, and frankly is probably a better suited to in many cases to public financing. So yeah, I would definitely agree that the approaches are different depending on whether it's conservation or restoration.
Okay, I'm going to go on to question 2. Oh, sorry, Rob, did you have a comment there?
Yeah, I was just going to underscore, I think it's really important, though, that we recognize the private land base may lend itself more to private investment to some extent than the Crown land base. But certainly, this issue of avoided emissions being critically important to maintain carbon sinks, as well as removals. So by protecting these, intact landscape, we protect not only the carbon that's stored there, but the ability to continue to sequester carbon. So we really do need both. And it may take different types of financial instruments to do both, but they're both important. So just wanted to underscore that.
Okay. And it may take a little while for Stewart to join us because apparently power's gone out
Oh no.
at his
Oh.
home. So we'll just keep on going. How's that? Next question I have: can you speak to the challenges in terms of the timing of funding a project? Large sums of money are needed upfront to protect a property to begin restoring a property, while benefits often accrue over a longer time. For example, as a forest grows, right? So, what are some of the models that could work to overcome this challenge? So, you're all thinking about it. Who wants to jump in?
I'll jump
I
in on
can,
one. I mean,
I can
certainly.
Thanks,
try.
Rob.
Oh, sorry, Mandy.
Thank you, Rob. I just wanted to address this because it was one of the things that we encountered when we were very fortunate to be selected for the Challenge Fund. We had a lot of funding that came in. It was broken down into percentages that were a little bit hard for us to meet. And then, of course, we had the double boom of being hit with COVID. And we were not able to undertake a lot of the work that we had scheduled for the first and second years of our project. In a way, I think it was kind of like a hidden benefit because it did allow for us to move funding around and to be able to carry over dollars and kind of compound the financial efforts that we were going to put towards other components in our project. So it is, I think, when you are creating funding opportunities that you have to take into consideration what I had mentioned, that it has to be almost a tailored approach to each Indigenous nation's project, and to kind of have a little bit of leniency and flexibility in the percentages of funding distribution. The targets that you set sometimes can be completely out of line with the goals of what the project is. So I think that's something that's really important to be reviewed when you're planning on distributing funding. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. Anybody else wanted to comment on this one?
Yeah, maybe I make a couple of comments just because, when you're acquiring large scale projects, you do require a significant upfront funding, and that is difficult to source. So it's, one of the mechanisms that is being looked at is carbon is one of the obvious ways of trying to create a sustainable revenue stream on a landscape. And you could try to monetize that upfront and sell off that revenue stream to investors upfront to get some capital. Typically, though, there's always a hole. There's always a deficiency. It's not sufficient. So I kind of come back to also the first panel where they talked about still the importance of catalytic philanthropy or early stage investors that are willing to put capital at risk to help get projects underway. So if we take this kind of blended finance approach, we can look at a variety of investors that will commit capital with different return requirements. So that's one sort of blended finance approach to trying to think about that.
Good. Thank you. Next question. The viewer writes, I was struck by Karen Clark Whistler's comments, so in our first panel today, that we need to develop a consistent set of principles and criteria for nature-based solutions in order to scale up to global markets. Any further thoughts on where we are on this front and what we need to do?
Well, I spoke in my opening remarks about the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. We do need standardized approaches to valuation in to some regard. We need to have standardized approaches and taxonomy that are respected by and understood by the investment community if we're going to be attracting private investment dollars. And that's why, we believe that, the work of a global effort such as CCRI is so important, and why it's been so important for Canada to join that conversation and help contribute to it. So that would be our take.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I think at the principles level as well, even maybe taking it up a step higher, we really, from the environmental conservation perspective, we really need to take an and approach. And so there is a lot of sometimes uncertainty around nature-based solutions, or if we put too much attention on nature-based solutions, will we take the pedal off of reducing fossil fuel? And so I think that we can address some of that at the principle level, that we do nature-based solutions in conjunction with pricing carbon, reducing fossil fuel use, reducing the impacts that to nature itself. We also deploy nature-based solutions in a way that has biodiversity safeguards and economic safeguards, and agree on that set of principles that we're going to move full force forward with nature-based solutions, knowing we're going to safeguard biodiversity, and we're going to do all the other things and take that all of the above approach.
We've heard a lot about the upside of offsets for conservation financing. Are there any downsides? Is there possibility, for example, of disincentivizing direct GHG emission reductions?
Jane, maybe I'll take one crack at that. There is ways of doing that, and it's important that we don't do that. So one of the things we do, and it's really helpful, is follow the mitigation hierarchy. So certainly when we as NCC are selling offsets from the Darkwoods project, we actually pre-qualify any buyer and have to be assured that they are following the principles of the mitigation hierarchy. And that really is that you avoid, minimize, restore, remediate, and what you can't avoid, what you can't minimize, what you can't restore, then you go to offsets. So it's really important that people just don't gravitate to offsets in order to avoid undertaking actions that reduce their emissions first. They ought not to be doing that anyway, economically, one would hope. But it's a pretty good principle to follow, I think, that we want to make sure that that's kind of the last piece you go to.
Anybody else want to comment? No? Okay. I think Stewart had left you with one last challenge. So if he were here, he would ask you, right? What is the single most important thing that Canada must do to unleash financing to support nature conservation and restoration? And I'm just going to ask you for, as they used to call it on Jeopardy, the short snappers, right? The short answer at the end. So the single most important thing that Canada can do to unleash finance for restoration.
Jane, you need to tell us what order we're going in.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Whoever wants to jump in. You know what, Rob? You kick off, and then we'll go Rob, Mandy, Craig, and Amanda.
Sure.
Sorry.
Sure. I think, one of the things that's going to be really important is we talk about data, but the importance of getting good data across the country, whether that's carbon mapping, whether it's flood risk mapping, high conservation value mapping, but ways of trying to create data that we can monitor over time and then start to report on outcomes to investors. We need to align investor expectations with our ability to deliver outcomes. So I think that's really important. And that would be, the government can certainly be of assistance in helping create those data sets to help us across the country. That's one place. So Amanda, I think it was you.
Mandy. Yeah, Mandy, your thoughts.
Yeah, Mandy? Okay. Thank you. I think for me, the biggest mechanism that they can create is for it to be legally binding, to ensure that, not only industry, but society as a whole has to commit a certain component of either their revenue or their operating budgets towards initiatives that are put in place for protection and conservation. I really believe that we are at that point where we now have to make these kinds of attitudes and behaviors mandatory. In addition, I would love to see recognition for the work that has been put in place. A lot of Indigenous groups have committed to these large-scale projects, have set aside territories. They do not qualify for carbon, but I do believe that they should be compensated for their efforts because it is an ongoing project that they've committed to for long periods of time. And of course, most importantly, I think committing to UNDRIP and recognizing the role that First Nations have here in Canada, especially when undertaking conservation and protection of the environment. I think that there is a very large capacity and a very large pool, wealth of knowledge that Indigenous people have, and it can contribute significantly towards the conservation efforts that are being undertaken.
Thank you, Mandy. Craig?
So I would answer quickly that we've had a national debate here in Canada about how to price carbon, how to price emissions reduction, and we actually have a framework, hopefully now agreed upon, about how we're going to do that. Certainly, there's been tremendous thought leadership in that area. We're not there with regards to pricing climate resilience, pricing climate risk, or the area known as PCRs, and this is an area that has to be addressed in Canada. Is how we're going to do a better job of coming up with that framework, because we need a standard framework for pricing resilience, pricing climate risk, if we're then going to be able to invest in addressing that risk. And that includes nature-based investments.
And take it home, Amanda.
And I am going to think big. I think that Canada should take the $4 billion investment that the federal government has made into natural climate solutions. We should collectively increase that ambition to $10 billion, and then look to the corporate sector, Crown governments, Indigenous and governments, NGOs, and philanthropy, and look at how we're going to attract that capital and then deploy it. And that would include things like finishing the offset regulation and protocols to drive that capital market, developing incentive programs, investing in data and research, and developing big public-private finance vehicles for protection of natural areas.
Thank you so much. Amanda Reed, Craig Stewart, Mandy Gull, Rob Wilson, thanks for joining us and sharing your passions and your knowledge on this panel. Thank you, Stewart, wherever you are. We really appreciate all the work you did bringing this panel together. It's been tremendous. And thank you, I'll say thank you to the four of you for having the patience with your substitute moderator in the last 10 minutes.
Thank you for jumping in.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jane.